You're standing in a stone courtyard in Egypt, the sun already high overhead. It's around 2400 BC. Carved into the tomb wall ahead of you is one of the oldest surgical scenes ever recorded. No consent form, no numbing cream, just two priests, a flint blade, and a boy told to hold still. This wasn't punishment. Somewhere on Earth, for at least the last 4,000 years, someone has been doing this exact thing to young boys. And it kept appearing on its own, on different continents, among cultures that never made contact with each other. Today, roughly 1 in 3 men alive have had this done to them. It's one of the most widespread surgical procedures in human history, and for most of that history, almost nobody who did it could agree on why. How did dozens of unconnected societies, thousands of miles apart, land on the exact same act? Egyptian priests treated it as ritual purity. Aboriginal elders, oceans away, treated it as the hardest physical test a boy could survive. Same result. Completely different reasons. So what does a Bronze Age temple wall have to do with a decision that's still made quietly in hospitals today, usually before a baby is even a day old? Let's start with the hardest evidence historians actually have. That tomb is real. It's in Saqqara, in a burial complex nicknamed the Physician's Tomb, dated to around 2400 BC. That makes it the oldest known depiction of circumcision anywhere on Earth. Carved in stone roughly 1,000 years before Moses, and more than 2,000 years before Rome existed. 4,000 years is longer than coined money has existed, longer than most of the alphabets you could be reading this sentence in. It very nearly predates writing itself. Egypt didn't treat this as some fringe habit either. Centuries later, the Greek historian Herodotus visited and wrote that Egyptian priests were required to be circumcised, and that Egyptians prized personal cleanliness above almost everything, even good manners. By his account, it wasn't just a private choice. It was one of the requirements for stepping inside the temple at all. Purity, to the Egyptians, wasn't only spiritual, it was written directly onto the body. Some modern researchers have floated a more practical theory alongside that one, that in a landscape of sand, heat, and minimal washing, the procedure may have simply reduced infection risk centuries before anyone had the concept of germs to explain why it worked. Here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind, though. If Egypt were the only place doing this, you could write it off as one culture's quirk. It isn't. Long before any European contact, large parts of sub-Saharan Africa were circumcising teenage boys as the final stage of becoming a man. Not privately, but in front of the whole community, as a test of whether a boy could take real pain without flinching. On the far side of the Indian Ocean, Aboriginal Australian groups were doing something strikingly similar, treating it as one of the most serious ordeals a young man could go through. In some of these traditions, the physical act itself was only the beginning. Boys were pulled out of daily life for weeks at a time, kept apart from women and children, taught knowledge reserved only for initiated men, and expected to survive additional trials before they were allowed back into the community with a completely different status. The cutting wasn't the ordeal. It was the entrance exam. In some of these cultures, the whole cycle happens only once every few years, meaning an entire cohort of boys goes through it together, bound for the rest of their lives by having endured the exact same trial on the exact same day. None of these societies were in contact. No shared texts, no shared trade routes, oceans between most of them. And yet they landed on the same physical act, again and again, to mark the exact same moment. A boy stops being a boy. Anthropologists have a term for this pattern: convergent cultural evolution. Unrelated societies independently arriving at the same solution because they're facing a genuinely similar problem. the same way separate cultures independently invented pottery, or the bow, or a calendar without ever comparing notes. That's the explanation most people default to, a coming-of-age test, a badge of manhood. It's real, and it's ancient, and it accounts for a huge share of the historical record. But it doesn't account for everything. Because somewhere else entirely, a group of ancient people were doing this to infants, 8 days old, babies who couldn't prove anything, endure anything, or consent to anything. That's the origin story in Genesis. Abraham, in his 90s, is told to circumcise every male in his household as a permanent physical sign of a covenant with God, and every son afterward on the 8th day of life. Not a test, not a rite of passage. The Hebrew term for it, Brit Milah, literally translates to covenant of circumcision. A mark cut into the body before the person wearing it can possibly understand what it means. Islamic tradition later carried forward a version of the same idea, known as khitan, generally performed later in childhood, but rooted in the same shared story of the same patriarch. So now there are two completely different explanations sitting side by side, an ordeal you survive to prove yourself, and a covenant placed on you before you can even talk. Different continents, different meanings. Identical physical outcome. Here's a piece of this story most people have never heard, though, because it has nothing to do with religion or ritual. It comes down to one specific, very anxious man in 19th century America. His name was John Harvey Kellogg. Yes, that Kellogg, the cereal one. Long before cornflakes made him famous, he was a physician fixated on what he called self-abuse. And he became one of the loudest American voices pushing routine infant circumcision. Not for hygiene, not for religion, but as a deterrent against masturbation. He wrote that it should be performed without anesthesia, specifically so the pain itself would act as a lasting punishment. Picture the moral panic of Victorian medicine as its own character for a second, humorless, permanently alarmed, and completely convinced that ordinary childhood behavior was a medical emergency. Kellogg wasn't some fringe outlier inside that world. He was one of its most respected voices. And it worked, in the sense that a campaign built on a theory modern medicine has completely abandoned, usually shouldn't. At the start of the 20th century, only around 1 in 3 American baby boys were circumcised. By the 1970s, that number had climbed past 8 in 10, not because of some sudden religious revival, but because generations of doctors had simply come to treat it as a routine, expected part of a hospital birth. Today, it gets scheduled somewhere between a diaper check and the hearing test, with about as much ceremony as filling out an insurance form. Assumption, meet, reveal. Most people assume the American version of this tradition is a religious leftover. It mostly isn't. It's a leftover of Victorian anxiety about sex, dressed up as medicine. Ask parents making this choice today why they're doing it, and religion barely comes up in a lot of countries anymore. Survey after survey turns up the same handful of answers. It should look like the fathers. It seems cleaner. Or simply, everyone else does it. A 4,000-year-old ritual, and one of its most common modern justifications, is essentially peer pressure, quietly passed down between generations who never actually sat down and discussed why. And here's where the story gets stranger still, because in the last 2 decades, this ancient, tangled, multi-motive practice has ended up back in serious medical research, for a reason nobody in Bronze Age Egypt or Victorian Michigan could have possibly predicted. Starting in the mid-2000s, 3 separate randomized trials. In Orange Farm, South Africa, Kisumu, Kenya, and Rakai, Uganda, including work led by researchers such as Robert Bailey, then at the University of Illinois, found that circumcised men had a significantly lower risk of contracting HIV through heterosexual sex. All 3 trials, run by separate teams who weren't coordinating with each other, landed in roughly the same range, efficacy estimates of about 50 to 60% fewer new infections. That kind of consistency, replicated 3 separate times, is rare in public health research. These weren't small pilot studies either. Researchers tracked thousands of men over multiple years, making it one of the largest coordinated HIV prevention research efforts the continent had seen. The finding was strong enough that the World Health Organization began recommending circumcision as part of HIV prevention strategy in high-transmission regions of Africa. Millions of procedures have since been performed there specifically because of that data, entirely separate from and layered on top of the coming-of-age traditions. Many of those same communities already practiced for reasons that have nothing to do with a virus. You'd think a finding like that would settle the debate. It hasn't. Major medical bodies in the United States and parts of Africa lean toward recommending it. Major medical bodies in places like the Netherlands and Denmark have said close to the opposite, that performing permanent surgery on a child who can't consent isn't justified by a statistical risk reduction, HIV or not. Meanwhile, across much of Europe generally, rates have been quietly falling for decades. Islam alone, today, accounts for more circumcised men than any other single tradition on earth, the single largest reason behind that 1 in 3 statistic from the start of this video. So, depending entirely on where and when you happen to be born, this one act might have meant a mark of religious devotion, a test you had to physically survive to earn respect as a man, a Victorian doctor's crusade against masturbation, or a modern public health intervention against a virus that didn't exist for most of human history. 4 completely different reasons, invented independently on 4 different continents, all arriving at one identical physical outcome. Every explanation kept changing. The result on the body never did. We call it tradition, or medicine, or religion, depending on which century and continent you happen to be born into. What we almost never call it is the one thing every single version of this story actually has in common. The person it happens to is almost never the one who decides. Not the boy on that tomb wall, held down by 2 priests who were never planning on asking him first. Not the infant marked 8 days into his life. Not the teenager expected not to flinch in front of his entire village. Not most boys born into a hospital today, where the whole decision is usually finished before they've been alive for 48 hours. The inscription on that tomb wall said, "Hold him still." 4,000 years, 4 continents, and 4 unrelated reasons later, that's still, more or less, the entire plan. That boy on the temple wall never got a vote either.